Sego, if you like what we're doing here, if you support the show and you want to give support to the show, you can do so by going to patreon.com/Let's Talk Native. And if you do so, we'll provide you some exclusive content and some things that others aren't going to get when you get it. So support us by going to Patreon. Yahweh.
Let's Talk Native is produced at the LTN Studios on the Cattaraugus territory of the Seneca Nation. We break all the rules for Native media by peeling back the layers of assimilation and indoctrination. We may step on a few toes through our examination of culture, art, politics, history, and identity. But the real goal here is to bring our people together by breaking down what separates us. So, welcome to Let's Talk Native with John Kane.
Sego, I'm John Kane. Let's talk Native. Of course, if you're Rick Santorum, there's not much to talk about. I don't know if you've heard, but Rick Santorum was giving some speech to some young people someplace, I guess, in the United States, and went on this long rant about American exceptionalism, how the United States was created out of nothing. There was nothing here. They created a blank slate, is what he described. We'll play some of the audio so you can hear from him exactly what he was talking about.
We came here and created a blank slate. We birthed a nation from nothing. I mean, there's nothing here. I mean, yes, we have Native Americans, but candidly, that there isn't much Native American culture in American culture.
All right, so it's almost tough to know where to start with this, but let me begin by saying what Rick Santorum was saying is a widely held belief. I mean, it's wrong. I mean, don't get me wrong, it is wrong. But this is a widely held belief, and I don't mean just a widely held belief right now. It has always been a widely held belief. This idea that the United States, that North America was an empty land just waiting for somebody to create a great nation out of is just pure bullshit. But it goes back to Columbus's voyage, stumbling upon some islands in the Caribbean. The reference from the Pope referred to terra nullius, the concept of vacant land. Terra means land, nullus means void. So basically, void of humanity is essentially what the church regarded, not just the Caribbean islands or the lands that were being discovered, I guess, but frankly, any lands that didn't have Christians on them could be regarded as terra nullius, lands void of humanity, because they could look at pagans or non-Christians as less than human. And in fact, they would go farther than that. They would actually refer to non-Christians as enemies of Christ. So that's all part of the doctrine of Christian discovery. And these are this doctrine is born out of papal bulls from the 16th, the 15th and 16th centuries, and it lays down some of the very things that Santorum and others are still saying. I mean, it's important to realize that what Rick Santorum was saying is learned. I mean, you don't pop out of the womb, even as a white guy, a racist. You have to learn to be a racist. So you have to learn this stuff. And let's be clear, Rick Santorum is a very educated guy. I mean, this isn't a guy who doesn't know, hasn't ever taught history or been taught history. I mean, he's a lawyer. He was a U.S. senator from Pennsylvania, not from some backwater southern state. If that's the way you view that. But no, this was a northern educated white man. And he was a senator for over 12 years, ran for president, almost got the Republican nomination. And now he's a CNN contributor. We'll talk about CNN. But what he was expressing there is it's classic white supremacy, because in order to demonstrate greatness or white supremacy, you've got to disparage everything else. You've got to call down everything that's not white. I mean, his whole speech was about how Europeans came to this vacant land that had nothing on it and no one to contribute anything of value. And they came to this new land escaping religious persecution, which, let me just say this right off the bat, that's more bullshit. The vast and overwhelming majority of Europeans throughout history who came to North America were not escaping religious persecution. I mean, there were people who came that were escaping political persecution. So whether you're talking about Irish or Italian immigrants or any of them, they didn't come escaping religious persecution. They weren't coming to be free from a religious or a spiritual standpoint. This is all built into that whole pilgrim, the Mayflower story and all that stuff. And of course, most white folks who showed up in North America were not escaping religious persecution. That's just simply a lie. But it's a lie that was taught and continues to be taught. I think it's really important to understand where a guy like Rick Santorum gets all of these beliefs from. I mean, again, it's taught even as a form of religious catechism. This idea of the greatness of the Judeo-Christian work ethic. I mean, the fact that the United States was essentially built out of stolen land and stolen labor and extermination of people. I mean, it's genocide and slavery. Genocide of Native people and enslavement of both Native people and of Africans. But so how do we have this story so mixed up? Well, I mean, it really comes down to how things are taught in school. I mean, I'll give you an example. I was looking at a few pieces from some elementary school workbooks. One of these elementary school workbooks, and I'll start with a great one from I think it's a third grade or grade 3, as they say in Canada, workbook, and it is from the Canadian side. It says, when European settlers arrived, they needed land to live on. The First Nations peoples agreed to move to different areas to make room for them in their new settlement. This is literally what is printed in a textbook. That First Nations people agreed to move to different areas to make room for the new settlement. I mean, I don't know how you could mischaracterize truth any greater than that. Well, but I do have another example. But so if this is what's taught to you as a third grader, and then it's never corrected. See, I don't believe you should teach something that's false just to be age appropriate, and then later you'll correct what you taught them in third grade. It just doesn't happen. That doesn't happen. So, but I do realize that history is ugly. I mean, when you think about the atrocities that were committed against Native people, against Black people, I realize that these are tough subjects. But if you're going to teach a lie as it relates to some of this stuff, with some kind of obscure plan to rectify that truth or those lies later. Here's another example. This is from the U.S. side. This is a some language that was taken out of a workbook from Pittsford, New York. Pittsford, and that's near Rochester. And so it just made news because it recently was exposed, and now they've taken it out of the part of their curriculum. But this was dealing with slavery, and of course they don't say slavery; They have to keep referring to people as slaves, and I have a problem with that. I won't say that I don't make the mistake sometimes, but if you're going to talk about a person and you're going to identify a person, you shouldn't identify them by the crime that they were a victim of. So I would rather refer to the enslaved or an enslaved people than to call them slaves. But why did slaves come to America? Yeah, this is an actual question, and it has a sentence where only one line has to have the blank filled, and it says, "As an exchange for the trip to America, African Americans agreed to work for the colonists for blank number of years, but then were kept as slaves." So what it's saying is that all of those Africans, and they're already calling them African Americans, which is kind of crazy. All of those Africans agreed to be chained in the bottom of a boat and dragged to another continent and distributed not just to North America but South America through all of it. This is one of the greatest crimes ever committed. This idea of the transatlantic slave trade. I do have to remind people, though, the first boat that crossed the Atlantic with slaves was a boat carrying native people from the Caribbean back to Spain. So the first transatlantic slave ship was bringing native people that were, again, chained in a boat to be brought back to Spain. But the idea that they would suggest, and of course call them African Americans right off the bat, that they agreed, that they made some sort of agreement. Well, in exchange for the boat ride, we'll work for you for a couple of years. I'm sorry. That is just a bald-faced lie. And then at the very end it says, but then they were kept as slaves. I mean, it's like, yeah, that was the original contract, but they had their contract renegotiated at the end, and so now they had to be slaves forever and ever. I mean, but this is what is being taught to kids. And if you teach this to a child, again, you cannot say, well, this is how we're going to teach it now to be age appropriate, and we'll fix it later on. So, again, as I talk about where does a guy like Rick Santorum get these crazy ideas, it comes from his church upbringing. It comes from the Catholic Church, and frankly, the other denominations too. It comes from just out of the pure sense of racism and white supremacy. But it isn't just guys like Rick Santorum. Look, I've talked about the doctrine of Christian discovery many times on the show. And I had to remind people that Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the liberal darling of the Supreme Court for many, many, many years, too many years, cited the doctrine of Christian discovery in 2005 as in her footnotes, and it was part of her rationale for throwing out a case where the Oneidas were trying to reclaim lost land. And they weren't like suing people or chasing people off or running, white people off their land. They were buying it. And then says, no, we have a Supreme Court ruling that acknowledges that we have a right to this title or to claim title or sue for title. We didn't either. We bought the land, and now we are reclaiming it as Oneida land. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg cites the doctrine of Christian discovery in her footnotes as part of the rationale for why that can't happen. So a Jewish woman on the Supreme Court in 2005. Now, again, we're not talking about something that was, espoused during the 1800s. Although this is the doctrine of Christian discovery becomes codified into U.S. law in 1823 in what is referred to as the Johnson v. McIntosh, the Johnson versus McIntosh decision by Chief Justice John Marshall wrote the opinion. And again, he reduced Native people as almost like we were just the animals that lived here. We didn't have the right to claim title to land. And that's what he said, because we weren't Christians. We were more like the animals. And all we did was have some sense or some right to occupancy. But even that right to occupancy was ultimately denied. But we didn't have the right to claim land. We just had the right to occupy space. And of course, when you consider all of the massacres and the murders and the intentional spread of disease, in spite of what John Marshall said, our right to occupy space didn't even exist. Not in the United States. But, to address a little bit more of what Santorum had to say, what Santorum suggested was that, oh yeah, there were Native Americans here, but there is, and what he said was there's almost no Native American culture that's a part of American culture. Well, look, there's no question that white people who understood what Native people represented used many parts of our culture. They used it as the rationale for rebelling against Great Britain. In fact, for many, many years, Native people weren't just called Indians, a misnomer that came out of Columbus. But when Europeans were referring to Americans, they were referring to Native people. Well, no fine, upstanding white man would call himself an American. It wasn't until they started pursuing this notion or this idea of separation from Europe that they had to now connect themselves to land. Look, our word for native person is ungwe ungwe, and that word means that we are original or that we're real. We are real human beings, because a real human being has to have a connection to the space, to the land that supports them and that has reared them, so to speak. So the colonists had to have a change of thought. And they grabbed some of that reasoning from the way Native people connected themselves to land. So essentially, as Jefferson's writing the Declaration of Independence and referring to us as merciless Indian savages along the way, he's actually citing some very clear Native principles that we are a distinct people because of the distinct land that we live on, and that informs who we are. And of course, guys like Ben Franklin would actually make comments about the union that the Six Nations had formed that had lasted thousands of years, and he would actually say, how is it that ignorant savages could form such a union? Yeah, that's what he referred to as ignorant savages, while 13 colonists of fine white bread can't come to an agreement to form a union. I mean, so we were used even in their debates to rebel against Great Britain. And as they formed their new nation, they used concepts like people serving the public, being in public service. They weren't talking about creating royalty, although that was certainly a debate. They weren't trying to mimic what existed as the monarchies of Europe. No, they said, how about we put people in a position where they are the servants of the people? Well, that was a uniquely Haudenosaunee concept. And they didn't invent that by themselves. And I know a lot of people say, well, yeah, no, they drew all their principles from the Magna Carta. Bullshit. Again, more bullshit. It is well documented, through many of the quote unquote founding fathers of the United States, how much they had gleaned from the examples that not only the Haudenosaunee. Look, there was conversation about making the Delaware, the Lenape, a 14th colony. I mean, or a 14th state. I mean, there is no question that Native people had a significant influence. I'm not saying they didn't screw up everything that we ever suggested to them. They certainly left out women's rights or any kind of equal rights. They didn't understand that we really hung on to a principle that lacked hierarchy. I mean, in many ways, this notion of anarchy is about rejecting hierarchies. It's not just about chaos. We had a really defined, well-organized system that rejected hierarchy. We didn't. A chief was no higher than anybody else. A clan mother was no higher than anybody else. They had responsibilities, and why did they have the responsibilities? Because they demonstrated the talent to carry those responsibilities. You didn't select somebody to be a chief or a clan mother to honor them. No, you select them because they showed an aptitude to bringing people together and helping people resolve conflicts. That's why people were selected for those purposes. And those selections were not elevations. They weren't they were not being lifted up. Their heads were the same height. So these were the concepts that we held close to who we were. And oftentimes those kinds of conversations were a part of the development of the rationale by colonists. Of course, they rejected many of them. Why? Because they were aristocrats themselves. They were arrogant. They were men. They weren't going to elevate women to the same level that they had. Plus, they had already developed their own class system. They had property holders. I mean, look, Thomas Jefferson, had over 100 slaves. George Washington was a major landholder, swindler. I mean, that's what these guys did. I mean, they were about accumulating wealth, either by stealing property or exploiting, slave labor. That's what they all did. Now, and I'm not saying because they all did it, it's right. Because that's the other people say, well, you got to consider the time. That was acceptable. It was never acceptable to the people who lost their land or who were enslaved. We never accepted that stuff. So this is what gets lost in all of this translation here and over the years. But again, what Santorum was espousing is something that presidents, congressmen, senators, military leaders, they've been saying all of this stuff for years. There's nothing new that Rick Santorum said the other day that hasn't been said many, many times over. What I will say is you haven't heard such a bold telling of that belief system in quite some time. It used to be, look, those kinds of things were said right on the Senate floor, in the House chambers, in courts of law. Those very sentiments have been said over and over and over again. But Rick Santorum just said it last. So what's going to be the fallout? Well, the expectation would be, well, surely CNN would fire him. No. I will say, if any person, especially even a white guy, if any white man had stood up in public and spoke such disparaging ideas and was ever so insulting to any other group of people, Jewish people or black people or Muslim people or even refugees and immigrants, they would be fired. They would be fired. But Native people hold a special place in American history because we can be insulted, and I don't know if people just say, oh yeah, they got tough skin. We do. We actually have a part of our culture that says we have to have, our skin has to be 7 spans thick. So apparently, places like CNN think it's fine to insult Native people. In fact, CNN themselves, and if you recall back during the election coverage, when they put this whole one of the graphics up, they were trying to talk about the percentages of American voters. And they listed white people and black people and Hispanic. And then in one column, they never put Native people up there. But they had one column that said something else. So they had Asians, Hispanics, black people, and white people. And then something else. I mean, I don't even know. I mean, the assumption was that something else meant Native people. But I think it gave a percentage of something like 6% or something like that. We're not that high. So they must have lumped a whole lot of other people in there. But and again, CNN acknowledges that it was a mistake to have characterized it that way, but they never apologized to anybody. I mean, they constantly have people on there. And Wolf Blitzer, he's from Syracuse, New York. This is a guy who should kind of know better. I mean, you would think growing up in central New York, close to the seat of the Haudenosaunee, the Onondagas, you would think Wolf Blitzer would have something to say, but nah, he doesn't. I mean, look, they're all idiots. But the ignorance that these guys have isn't because they can't know this stuff. This is what I oftentimes refer to as willful ignorance. There's a choice that white people make to ignore truth, to ignore real history, and then rewrite history. Like they did with this, with this class in Canada, saying that First Nations people agreed to leave, agreed to leave their homelands so white people could have a new place to live, or teaching little white kids that why did why did African Americans come to America? I mean, if this is what you're taught as a child, even as other information comes, look, you can't go from third grade learning this kind of crap and go your whole life and not ever heard some truth about what slavery meant, what genocide meant. So what you do is you have to ignore this stuff. And, and I've talked about this before because it comes right back to, and I'm sorry, I'm going to bring it up again, the mascot issue. The whole idea that thousands of schools across the United States and even sports teams at universities and professional teams have used Native mascots. In order to do that, you have to erase the history, because nobody's going to want to use a Native people for mascots when you're only thinking about Native people as the victims of genocide. Who would ever want to use a victim of genocide for a mascot? So you ignore that. You pretend that didn't happen. And then you create in your own mind this notion of the noble savage, the brave, the courageous, the resilient. Resilient, we had our population almost eliminated. There were calls for our extermination from guys like L. Frank Baum and Theodore Roosevelt and some of the most prominent people in U.S. history. Were literally calling for our extermination. And they said, look, if we couldn't become them, we must be destroyed. That came off the Senate floor. The Secretary of the Interior basically, this was cited oftentimes with, as Deb Haaland was being put into that spot. She cited a former Interior Secretary who basically said that we needed to be destroyed. If we couldn't be assimilated, so if we couldn't have our culture stripped from us, if we couldn't get through the ethnic cleansing that is a part of assimilation, and assimilation is genocide, if we couldn't survive this process of Americanization, stripping away Native culture, and then pretending it doesn't exist, kind of like Rick Santorum. If we couldn't survive that, then we have to be destroyed. I mean, there's a whole logic that says, people all people on the planet are only on one of two planes. They are either a people who are being destroyed or a people who are rising up. Yeah, this was a widely held concept that you are either moving towards extinction or you are progressing to a higher elevation of civilization. And of course, if you're a people of color, if you're black or if you're brown or if you're Native, you are obviously on the extinction path, and every white person who could play a part was there to help that happen. The mascot issue, this idea of white people claiming, they're not really claiming to be Native people. They're just rewriting their own version of history to say, oh yeah, we're going to call ourselves Indians because they're brave. Well, who are they saying that we were brave against? Who are they saying that we displayed all this courage against? It was against the genocide that your people were committing against us. So it is really, really absurd when you think about how many people in high places, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, like I said, on the Supreme Court, some of the stuff, look, Barack Obama, Donald Trump, presidents of the United States, in recent times, espoused this notion of the great American dream. And, and many of them praised the whole idea of stripping land away from Native people. I mean, I heard Obama and Trump both praise the Allotment Act. This idea that you could, just separate Native people from lands. Why? So America could grow. These concepts are not just new to Rick Santorum. He's just an example. Yeah, sure, he's obnoxious. He's a right-wing hack. has been politically, but people pay. He was paid to speak to this group of young people. He was paid to do this. So this wasn't some offhand comment that he made, in some private setting. This is a guy being paid to espouse this crap. So not only was he taught this stuff, he is being paid to further teach others this crap. So when you question why somebody like me is speaking out against the mascot issue or against any of this revisionist history, and then you want to say, well, that's all part of cancel culture. Well, you're right. You're right. Because what cancel culture is people like me developing not just a culture, but the stamina and the power to speak out against false narratives. It's not about canceling culture. It is a culture of canceling false narratives. That's what cancel culture is. But people have misrepresented it over and over and over again. Who mostly? The right wing, just like the same ones who want to condemn political correctness. Hey, there is nothing wrong with correcting something that is wrong. I mean, in fact, it should be all of our goals and responsibilities to correct false narratives. And among the false narratives, if something is politically incorrect, it usually means it's incorrect. It means that you're saying something or doing something that is wrong. You're either saying something that's racist or bigoted or hypocritical. So the idea of correcting that hypocrisy and that bigotry and that racism, yeah, it is politically correct to do that. But to condemn political correctness, to condemn cancel culture, that is something that the right wing clings to. Because they have to. Because their power comes from one of the pillars of right-wing politics. And that's racism, white supremacy. That's why white people gather towards the right. Because they know that it's going to benefit the rich and the wealthy and the white. So Rick Santorum standing up and saying this stuff, it doesn't surprise me. I'm actually a little surprised at the reaction to it all by some. Of course, there stands CNN still keeping him on as a pundit. So look, I had to weigh in on this. I will say if you listen to what Santorum said in full, and perhaps even listen to it a couple of times, you will know that almost everything he said was wrong. Everything he said was wrong, from the idea that there was nobody here, to the reason Europeans came, to how they created something from nothing. And of course he conveniently left out, 500,000, black people who were either dragged from Africa directly or indirectly dragged up from South America after previously being dragged across the Atlantic, who would become the basis for the chattel slavery industry of the United States. One of the biggest and most successful economic stimulus concepts that the United States ever experienced. Stolen land and stolen labor. That is the bulwark of the United States. That's exactly what it is. Stolen land, stolen lives, stolen labor. And the murder that was necessary to accomplish all of that. That is what the United States was built on. And if it's uncomfortable, sorry, but that's the truth. That is the painful truth. So, by all means, understand what Rick Santorum had to say is a widely held lie. And you know what? And here's the thing. They know it's a lie, but they have to keep repeating it. It's that whole idea. Well, if we keep saying it enough, then people will believe it's true. And maybe I can begin to believe it. I don't have to feel bad about, the terrible things the United States has done to black people, to brown people, to Native people. again, I mentioned it a couple of times in the show. If you get a chance to catch Exterminate All the Brutes by Raoul Peck, it is a series that was on HBO. I would like to have a few people check it out. By the way, tomorrow, if you're listening to this show on Wednesday, on Thursday on WBI in New York, and on Friday on WPFW in Washington, my guest will be Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. She is a historian and an author, and has done a fine job, really putting out some of the true history as it relates to indigenous people and the United States. So if you get a chance, catch that show. It's on Thursday at 3 o'clock on WBAI, and it'll be streaming live online. And then on Friday at 2 p.m. Out of Washington, D.C., again, streaming on WPFW's website and on WBAI's website. I'll probably go ahead and stream it on Facebook as well. All right, folks. Thanks for listening. This is John Kane. This is Let's Talk Native. Yahweh.